Hello, everybody. I had an interesting conversation with Ben Howe, who is the author of the new book, The Immoral Majority, which is a fairly searing critique of the attitudes of evangelical Christians toward Trump and also toward the accumulation of political power in general. And Ben Howe is himself an evangelical Christian, so he writes from that perspective. Now, he's among the few remaining conservatives who maintain opposition to Trump, and he is aware, I think, that that is not a great number of people in totality. But I wanted to have a discussion with him that sort of avoided the typical never Trump discourse, but still took his ideas seriously. He's somebody who I've known in a remote online sense for many years, so I was glad to have this discussion with him, and let's get into it. All right, hello, Ben.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks. So you are somebody who I've observed from afar now for many years. I want to say going back to 2011, 2012, something like that. And you now...
all the stuff.
I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everywhere in between.
Right.
But you now have a new book out which sort of crystallizes your take on contemporary political affairs, and it's very critical, to put it lightly, of how conservative Christianity has morphed into a political mechanism to give power to somebody like Donald Trump, who you've opposed from the outset. So first, I'm sort of curious how you sort of summarize the reception that your book has gotten among your target audience, which it would seem to be your fellow conservative Christians, right? Do you feel as though you've had a reasonable dialogue with those people? Has it been fruitful? What has been the response?
Well, I would say in terms of target audience, it was difficult to identify exactly who my audience was. That was one of the reasons I would say I'm very thankful to HarperCollins. There was a risk there with the book, because I was writing what I believed to be true without necessarily a lot of fantastic indications that anybody else would have agreed with me. We're talking about a movement of evangelicals who, if I'm writing to them and talking about their approach to politics, they are fine with them by a margin of 81%. But I knew that if I was going to do this correctly, if I was going to do this in a way that was honest, I had to diagnose what I thought the problem was, and I thought the problem was spiritual. So I had to write it in a way where I talked about what I thought the spiritual problems were. And that sort of necessitated that even though I thought a lot of them would push back, that's who I had to write to. Even, so it's kind of like I was writing to the people who wouldn't read it.
Right.
Which is an interesting proposal.
So the reason why I characterized conservative evangelicals as your, quote, target audience is because you share many of the same premises as them in terms of political action and religious tenets, and therefore you can attempt to persuade them from their own perspective that they have gone awry in some way. So even though they may not read it, the ideal target audience would presumably be them, correct?
Yes. I mean, there was really no way to write it the way that I wanted to write it without it being to them. I did not, however, make it... I worked very hard to make sure that even though I was writing, in their language, in our language, if you will, that I was not making assumptions about what people know about evangelicalism, because I needed it to also be accessible to people who weren't part of it, and more importantly, in a way, to find it interesting and not like reading someone else's internal document. So I kind of worked hard to straddle that line. It wasn't always easy. I think in some of the later chapters, I moved directly into talking, directly to evangelicals, whereas the rest of the time I'm providing a little bit of a history, I'm providing a little bit of a context, and I'm explaining it in a way that I know will get head nods in terms of factual data of what happened, even if they are an evangelical, while at the same time informing people who may not know about everything that has happened over the last few decades.
Right. So what in general has been the response from that target audience to the extent that they've read it or that they've processed your thesis? Have they been willing to engage on it?
It's actually been very encouraging. It's been encouraging and sad because, and it just didn't occur to me before I wrote the book. And this is a good question. Nobody's actually asked me this. I like this question.
I ask all the questions that need to be asked. You'll find out.
That's right.
And
this is the last interview.
And you'll discover that even more as the interview goes on.
No, but it was encouraging because I did get a lot of emails and messages from my target audience. And they were supportive. They were very supportive. What was sad was how alone they had felt. They felt like they were alone in their church. They felt like they couldn't look at their church the way that they once had. Some of them, in fact, the first email I got the day the book was published was somebody saying he wasn't sure how he felt, and that he has been reading my book. Like, it was really early in the day. I don't know if he finished it, but he was certainly reading it. And he said that he felt like he's getting a better idea now. So I thought that was great, because I don't think that what I'm saying in the book is groundbreaking in terms of my analysis, if people are honest with themselves. But I think that there's a lot of people who are surrounded by so many others telling them that it's not true, or that's not the way to look at it, or just flat out trying to indoctrinate, that it can lead to some confusion. And I just happened to be in a position where I was able to articulate what I think a lot of people, more people than I realized, were thinking. So that's been good. That's been encouraging. And like I said, a little sad. Now, on the flip side, I have gotten messages telling me that I am upholding and supporting the satanic democratic cabal, and that I am going to roast in hellfires for all eternity. Judas is mentioned quite a lot. I think if I write a follow-up to this book, I may have to put in my contract that I'll get paid with 30 pieces of silver because of how often I get called Judas. And they somehow miss the implication that makes Trump Jesus, but what can you do?
And you did post a funny clip of one of your C-SPAN appearances where there were a number of, let's say, angry, to put it mildly, people calling in and accusing you of various demonic offenses.
That's right. And yeah, and to be clear, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture here. What I'm receiving in terms of messages, certainly anecdotal. I have not received tens of thousands or millions of messages. And you're always going to end up in a position where some of the loudest people or the most concerned people are going to be the ones who reach out to you. But even in my anecdotal situation, it's still coming out to about 80 negatives to 20 goods. Mm-hmm. And on the phone call, I would say, on C-SPAN, that's a lot of what those negative messages are like. People who are both completely repulsed that I'm trying to identify what rationalizations Christians and Christian leadership are offering in service of the Republican Party, while at the same time they're denying it. They're disgusted that I would claim such a thing. And then they proceed to, use those very rationalizations to defend their situation. So it's been interesting to watch the cognitive dissonance unfold.
Let me put a hypothetical to you. If Ted Cruz had won the Republican nomination in 2016, which was not implausible for a while throughout that cycle, I attended his campaign kickoff speech at Liberty University, and it seemed that he was gradually building up the kind of critical Christian political infrastructure that you'd need to win a Republican nomination, and then Trump sort of blew up those plans, although Cruz still did win the Iowa caucus, and he won some other subsequent primaries and caucuses. But let's say, things went differently and somehow Cruz won the Republican nomination. Would your critique of these political machinations on the part of, let's say, the Evangelical Christian establishment and the ways in which they have given themselves over to the Republican Party in service of power, would that critique be negated just because a different guy won the nomination?
No. What it would have been is the same situation that had made it so much easier for evangelicals to perhaps, including myself, to perhaps not detect it. Because the issue is, when you've got a George W. Bush or even a George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan who functions in a much more normal set of human parameters, let's say, than Donald Trump does, and especially when you're talking about a guy like George W. Bush who spoke the language of evangelicals and talked about his being born again and things like that, there's not as much cognitive dissonance required because you're not having to make huge gymnastic leaps in order to explain away how you could support such a person. He just doesn't put as much pressure on it. Cruz doesn't put as much pressure on it. So I would say that what I'm identifying in the book exists whether or not Ted Cruz had won, existed while George W. Bush was president, and was something that grew and became worse over decades of time. And honestly, truly, I start the book out by kind of acknowledging that because of my upbringing, because of the parents specifically that I was fortunate enough to have, who were they're just very good people. My dad's an apologetics professor, teaches Hebrew, and he was a Southern Baptist minister at first. But these are people that when I was doing drugs and dropping out of high school and being a maniac, they didn't, kick me out of the house and tell me I was going to hell. They actually invited all of these friends that were probably corrupting the crap out of me to come into the house and talk, and not even about religion if we didn't want to, just so he could interact with them and get to know them and not be an enemy. And I still have these friends and they still remember it. And there were others who had been kicked out of their houses and my mom took them in and fed them. So this was my understanding of Christianity. And I think I blinded myself with tribalism for a long time. And that's why I wasn't seeing the things that I saw once Trump became president. So at the beginning of the book, I established all of that so as I can say, I didn't start this book out thinking I was going to go back 4 decades and see a much larger problem. But I did. And once I saw what I saw, it changed a little bit of my perspective about what the problem is. It's not Trump. He reveals the problem. He does not cause it.
Right, which is sort of why I asked the question, which is because for your purposes, if, say, a Ted Cruz or somebody who was more overtly a genuine believer and comported themselves personally in a way that was in line with what you would view as the ideal Christian character, if somebody like that had gotten the
or at least not openly defying Christian character.
Right, exactly. If somebody like that had gotten the Republican nomination, then would there really have been an impetus for this sweeping investigation of the way in which Christian power is fused with political power?
Well,
So it does sort of hinge on Trump personally because he made the problem much more conspicuous and therefore gave you an entry point to examine these issues, right?
oh, absolutely. And there was also a confluence of events that assisted. I'll start out by saying I recognize that there were a lot of people telling me for a long time things that I now accept that are true. And, I have on many interviews already expressed that, like, yeah, it's true. Some people need a tap on the shoulder. Some people need a slap in the face. Some people need a piano on the head. I'm piano on the head type, I guess. And that's because I have I have a stubbornness that has existed for a long time, personally speaking. So to continue personally for a moment, right around the time that he became such a powerful figure in Republican politics in 2000. He had already existed, but he didn't quite have the pull he did once he came down that escalator in 2015. My personal life was kind of in turmoil, and I was going through a divorce, and that kind of experience really touches everything in your life, gives you an injection of nuance that I probably needed the shit out of, and it made it so when after everything that I was going through, I had the same people coming to me that had been telling me how horrible he was before, how horrible Trump was before, were suddenly telling me that he's our only hope for the future. I was just kind of done. I was like, I can't do what y'all are asking me to do. It was mostly a political calculation for me at that point. It wasn't about morality necessarily. I just thought, this guy's bad. He's bad for conservatism. He's bad for Republicans. Bad idea. We shouldn't do it. But then an interesting thing happened, which is the alt-right and, the bowels of the right came after me for doing that. And they doxed me and they wrote articles about my divorce and, with lies in it about me being a spousal abuser and my ex-wife had to flee the state and things like that. Which none of that's true. I have 50% custody. We live 2 doors down from each other. We get along great. But once I saw that in conjunction with, this injection of nuance that I had gotten and the piano dropping on my head, I couldn't unsee that I had been participating in something where I was identifying who my enemy was based solely on their political party, and that these are the people I'm fighting, so these are the bad guys. And I didn't have to confront who the bad guys were on my side because they were behind me, sort of fighting on my behalf at times or, in the trenches with me or whatever. It was very easy to live in that world because these guys aren't going to come after me. Once they did, it made it easier for me to step back even further and go, no, this isn't just about one president. This isn't about one candidate. This isn't about restructuring the GOP leadership. This is about a systemic problem on the right that is being ignored because too many people have drank the Kool-Aid of tribalism, and they can't see that there's evil right beside them. And that's where I ended up.
So the way in which you sort of fuse this political revelation you had with your own personal turmoil kind of brings to mind to me a common theme in much evangelical literature, which is that you are undergoing sort of like a redemption arc, or you have a redemptive story that you want to share where, in the classic formulation is you reach salvation when you accept that you're fallen and you take Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior, etc. So that sort of is the language in which many evangelicals are versed. Did you when you went into this project, did you sort of look to it in that sense? Obviously not that you were coming to view Christ as your Lord and Savior, which you already did, but you were kind of postulating a redemptive arc for yourself that sort of follows that formula?
No, not really. I mostly, when I sat down to write, there were a few things I wanted to be clear about. One of the first things that I wanted to be clear about was that I detest moralists, specifically ones who appear to believe there's some sort of bringing their righteousness to others, and I have no such illusions about myself. I wanted to make that clear, and I did use a lot of the things that I had now looked at differently as examples throughout the book, examples of how this was something I was a part of, but not as a way of saying, I've changed and you should change too. More like, I get it. I get where a lot of the need for these rationalizations comes from in your mind. I understand why you think that you're a victim of X, Y, and Z. I'm making the argument to these people, not that I've been redeemed, but more like, I'm seeing things you guys aren't seeing, and I want you to see them too. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you just made a passing reference to something that I feel like I should ask about, which is that you said your wife and now ex-wife had to flee the state when there were alt-right people coming after you in 2016 or 2015.
Oh, no.
When did
actually have to? She didn't actually have to. That was just what they were writing. They were writing stories about my divorce.
Oh, right, gotcha. Okay.
That they gleaned from their imagination, I suppose. We've never not gotten along. It was a very amicable situation. And so it really upset me when that happened, not because I was worried anybody that I knew would believe it. Everybody knew what was happening that I was friends or family with. My concern was my youngest daughter at the time was 4 years old, and she's not going to remember much of what happened. And the internet is forever in a lot of ways. And it worried me to think, well, what happens if, something tragic happens? What if both me and her mother, pass away, and then she finds this article? She can understand that that's not what happened. And it really bothered me. It was took fake news to a new level for me. Very, very personal.
Mm-hmm. So in reading this book, and I did read it, I don't know if most of your interviewers actually have read it, but I did. And
I can always tell when they actually have.
Okay, good. And one thing that occurred to me is that so much of the media emphasis has been on the alt-right as the main phenomenon in right-wing politics that needs to be examined in the Trump era, that it's sort of neglected tracing the evolution of evangelical Christianity in terms of its political orientation, which was much more prominent, for example, in the George W. Bush era in terms of at least media consciousness. Do you think that the focus on the alt-right has sort of obscured some of these developments that you're writing on? And you touch on the alt-right a little bit in the book, but do you think that it's sort of drowned out, meaning the focus on the alt-right, some of these trends that might have otherwise been analyzed among evangelical Christianity?
I think that there's a couple of complicated things at play with the alt-right. One is they aren't as big as people might think, at least among people who self-identify as alt-right. But the other is that the dangerous power that they wield is much greater, I think, than people have given it credit. And I think some of the recent shootings are evidence of that. So there's that aspect of it where I think they're identifying a real thing and a real problem, but I don't know that the media is always identifying it accurately. And the other aspect of it that I don't think is talked about enough, and I do talk about it in the book, is that the reason I don't spend that much time in the alt-right is because the culture that they brought to the 2016 election was for a lot of people on the right that had been in sort of mainstream online conservative politics for a while. It was newish to them. It was like you had antagonistic behaviors on the right, but this was like a new level. And there was like a lot of blatant anti-Semitism and racism that just wasn't as blatant before and was, arguably defensible. That's not really what I was saying, and so on. These guys were just straight up sending you memes of, yourself being put into a gas chamber. I mean, like, there was just no nuance at all to it. And with the thing that I think is important to take away is that the party at large kind of just adopted those characteristics. So when I think of the alt-right as a specific self-identified group, yes, they're smaller, but they're more dangerous because they've infected the mentality on the right. The right has become one big giant peep troll. And the president, tends to lead that charge in a lot of ways. And it's celebrated. It's applauded. And some of the people that would have been called establishment just a few years ago, they can totally change their fortunes in the Republican Party if they do something that's much more in line with something that a Cernovich would do, and that says something about the direction of the culture of the party. And arguably it was always headed that direction, which is a bad thing on its own. But that means that the alt-right's influence is what's dangerous in terms of how they've gotten people to view how to win. Their idea of how to win is to upset people. And you've probably seen as well as I have, that's pretty standard modus operandi for the rest of the party at this point.
I don't know. I'm sort of conflicted about that. On the one hand, yeah, the sort of confrontational, aggressive online approach that people in that somewhat amorphous, quote-unquote, movement pioneered have become a little more mainstream, but I sort of question whether you can really generalize it such that it's justified to assert that alt-right either ideology or tactics are really so thoroughly mainstream that you could say that they've infected the very heart of the Republican Party. I mean, I think a lot of Republicans sort of view them as a nuisance who need to be marginalized, right?
Well, the ones who self-identify, yeah, sure. Like, get them out. But the issue is, as is the case with any dangerous ideology, when the language that you're using to describe something that is dangerous, when the only thing you've changed is how complex the language is to make it sound nicer but still accomplish the same thing, that's really dangerous. So when I look at some of the shootings that involved manifestos and this forgotten man idea, which is an alt-right thing, white genocide and the fear that white people are being marginalized and hated, and that they're going to be under the thumbs of all other demographics soon enough, and et cetera. That's something that the alt-right pushes. Well, a lot of mainstream conservative thinkers in the wake of some of those shootings, when people pointed out, hey, this seems like a consistent, among at least a couple of these, this seems like a consistent problem ideologically speaking, they would condemn that action while at the same time offering a much more thorough explanation for how that person ended up there that really boiled down to, white genocide. I mean, they were giving the same idea that there is a forgotten man, that white people are put in a position where we are made to be ashamed of ourselves, and that if nothing is done, we can't be surprised when somebody loses it and starts shooting people. These are all alt-right ideas. They're just being repackaged. And when you combine that with the serious levels of trolling that tons of politicians, and most especially Donald Trump, engage in to great applause and calls of brilliance, it definitely sounds like the same culture to me, with just a little bit of a change in the presentation.
Right. But, I mean, weren't those trolling tactics evident prior to Trump? Maybe he sort of amplified it and gave it a little bit more of a mainstream purchase. But, and I think you admit this in various points in the book, I mean, there are aspects of that style of politicking that, predate Trump. So to kind of call it an alt-right phenomenon maybe makes you a sort of a hostage to the moment. Whereas it's something that's just sort of a long-standing trend.
It was not at the, it was not a accepted part of the party structure. It was not. You would not have had Matt Schlapp on any of the networks or any of the social media outlets where he has engaged in levels of trolling that is comparable to Trump's.
And he's the head. He's the head of the American Conservative Union, which runs CPAC and everything else.
Right. You would not have had Governor Huckabee encouraging everyone to vote for Sean Spicer in the Dancing with the Stars to prove something to godless Hollywood, followed by Sean Spicer quote tweeting it and saying that we need to do this because they hate all people who love Christ. Like these kinds of over-the-top culture warrior mentalities that focus on the fears over immigration and fears over demographic irrelevance and all of that, they were not as prevalent amongst the people that I was working with, nor were they as prevalent, really not prevalent at all, at the elected level. Again, I do think that those seeds were always there, or the alt-right wouldn't have existed in the first place. But nor would anybody have been easily influenced by it. So the seeds were there, certainly. But I think that when we try to separate them into here's how the alt-right behaves and here's how the rest of the GOP behaves, I just find too many similarities to spend that much time thinking that there's something uniquely different between them.
Do you think there's some kind of flaw in reasoning, in analysis of the alt-right that stems from the fact that the alt-right really became prevalent in media discourse as a result of their trolling on Twitter in particular, largely trolling of journalists? Because the trolls, correctly, it turns out, thought that if they bombarded journalists with the most, grotesque imagery and everything else, it would serve to sort of heighten their profile, and it would make them appear more influential than they actually are. So are we kind of going down this illogical rabbit hole by really making them out to be this tremendously influential force when really they're confined to a handful of guys who figure out how to master, how to manipulate the Twitter algorithm and almost bamboozle journalists into taking them to be more of a force than they actually ever were? That would be the counterpoint.
I guess what I would... No, I think that there's a strong piece of evidence that that's not the case, in my opinion. The strong piece of evidence is if you wanted to know what Donald Trump cares about or what he's concerned about at any given moment, go just look at what he talks about a lot. There's really no questioning what he thinks about Rosie O'Donnell. He's made it clear, There's really no question of what he thinks about certain other candidates or what he thinks about, Hillary Clinton. Obviously, he was running against her, but really anyone he's spent significant time or feels frustrated by, or James Comey or anyone, he hides nothing. And I think through that, we can also ask, where is the same level of concern about things that happened in Charlottesville or the alt-right, or the shootings that involved manifestos that sounded alt-right, or movements that are preaching things about white genocide? Where is the same level of condemnation? It usually comes at the specific request of others, but it is not something that he overtly calls for. I mean, he brought in as his campaign CEO, Steve Bannon, who famously said that Breitbart was the home of the alt-right. They wrote several articles. Milo Yiannopoulos and others wrote several articles defending the alt-right. And once he became president, it's not as though he started a campaign to purge the right of this disease. It's something that he's pretty quiet about, that the rest of them are pretty quiet about. And I think that that's telling in terms of whether or not they've had any influence. I think they do. I think they have a lot of influence.
Have you received any inquiries from people who you could characterize as being on the alt-right to engage with you about any of these arguments? Would you be willing to engage with them, or is it sort of a lost cause?
I have a hard time imagining a genuine invitation of good faith discussion. I haven't received any. I have received, the normal stuff, the stuff you were just talking about amongst those 5 guys that are making trouble with their peep frog accounts. They've certainly come after, but they never stopped. Right. So that's nothing unusual for me. I think though that their mission statements are kind of organically growing on their own, and I think the danger is there's going to be people, more and more people, who may repeat the same things and not self-identify as alt-right. And, using the manifestos again, I'm not pretending that all the shootings have been as a result of that, but there were a couple that had similar manifestos that had complicated, thought out ideas that elaborated on what had been projected throughout 2016 in meme form, which means it's like that. The basis and the structure of their beliefs is becoming more solidified and becoming more, using language that can be more consumable to the mainstream. So without a party, the very party that group would definitely vote for, without a party, that party standing up to that idea and calling it out with as much vigor as they call out voting on Dancing with the Stars, I think it continues to be a problem of their power. It's not about their numbers. It's about their power.
Mm. So we talked a little bit earlier about the intended audience of this book, and let's just be honest, you're kind of hitting a liberal sweet spot with this book, in the sense that you are a conservative who is criticizing Trump in stark terms from a conservative standpoint. A lot of the people who take that approach have risen through the ranks of the media ecosystem in the past couple years, where they get prominent positions on MSNBC, lucrative book deals.
Sure. And it's actually really seductive, I would say.
It's really what?
The whole idea. It's really seductive, I think, for anybody to be in that position, for sure.
And how have you dealt with that seductive temptation? I mean, did that factor in to your decision to go down this path, or was it something that you considered? How do you deal with the potential seductive quality of? Well,
the seduction I mentioned is the reason I mention that is because sometimes what you see is a conservative who comes out to oppose Trump and let everybody know that he's going to stand by his principles and he's not going to vote for this guy. And the issue often quickly becomes when they are really pushing eventually for essentially the Democrat platform and a liberal or progressive ideology, while still saying conservative critic, it becomes a different form of cognitive dissonance. They're just not a conservative anymore, And I have a aversion to making decisions that I think violate my convictions and principles out of personal benefit. I'm seeking personal benefit. I need to pay my bills, certainly. But I don't ever want to be in a position where I can't look at myself in the mirror in the morning. So when I get in those situations, I think that what's changed about me is, no, I'm not going to shift what I believe. I'm not going to shift my views, but I'm more excited to talk to somebody who doesn't agree with me, but is willing to talk to me, than I am to try to conform myself in order to appease them. And if that means I get less attention, I get less TV or whatever, that's totally fine. I can live with that. And I have been in that position before. In 2016, they kept inviting me on, various networks, to be a guy from RedState, RedState.com, who was saying these things. But it also started to become clear as the election had passed and Trump had won, that I was going to continue to be invited, but on matters where I could be critical of Republicans. At first, I thought, as long as I'm saying what I think, that's fine. But eventually, I started turning things down. I just started sending them to someone else. So this person's probably better on tax policy, and I like the tax cuts. So I don't think I'm the right guy. I think that there's no great suffering as a result of that. There's no sacrifice. I'm not brave for not going on TV. So I just tried to maintain that and continue to carve out my own little area and hope that people wanted to hear what I had to say. And so far, there's been at least some.
Yeah, I think the difficulty there is that you describe Trump and the movement around Trump in such negative terms that it's almost going to get automatically conflated with liberal critiques of Trump and the Trump movement, because it's almost similar language. And in some ways, like at one point in the book, that you say that the Trumpian movement is just immoral overall. And if that's what you believe, then I think it's a reasonable inference, at least if you take it at face value, for that to advance some kind of liberal political goal or liberal
right.
political take on events, right? Because there are a lot of people who have criticisms of Trump or the Trump movement who wouldn't just in broad strokes describe the entire thing as immoral. That's sort of crossing a line.
Right. Well, I don't agree, because I think that in the context of the rest of the book, what's important that I hope people get from it is I don't believe that anybody's moral. I don't believe that anyone is inherently moral. As part of my Christian faith, I don't believe that. I don't believe that we are righteous, or that righteousness comes from within us. And when I'm identifying what I believe that evangelical movement is doing that's immoral and worth talking about, I'm not attempting to say this is uniquely, especially immoral as opposed to other immoralities. I'm saying this is the home, the world, the place that I've come from, and I have a personal desire to deal with the world I come from first. And here my problem is the immorality I'm identifying is people who believe that they are serving God by taking ownership of his power and speaking of righteousness as though it comes from within them. That's the immorality that I'm identifying, and I feel fine calling that immoral. Is it broad and sweeping? Absolutely. I don't know how else to operate, though. We've got a left and a right. We've got a Democrat Party and a Republican Party. And then we've got millions and millions and millions of people. So we have ways of gleaning things, whether it's polling or personal interactions, articles, interviews, politicians, who gets voted into office, and so on. All of these ways to try to get our best determination about what's going on in this particular side or that particular side. And we all usually feel comfortable saying, here's what the left thinks, here's what the right thinks, and so on. I'm saying everything that I've experienced personally, and I feel like I'm in a good position to discuss, combined with all of these other aspects, other books, historical data, polling, election results, anecdotal interviews, everything that I could think of, leadership, they tell me this story. And a pushback that I get a lot is, well, I think you're tapping into a very thin vein. Most evangelicals think X, Y, and Z. And I always push back at that point and say, sweeping judgments don't have to be bad. You can make a good sweeping judgment. In fact, most of the people who push back on me, they are. They're saying, no, this is how most of them are. Well, that's still a sweeping judgment. So you make these determinations based on the best available data, and I think that that's what I try to do in the book. But if anyone thinks that finding out that, no, everything's wrong, most of them don't think this or that, I find that to be totally contrary to the evidence. But, hey, that would be great news.
So you've worked over the years for a lot of conservative media outlets, including The Blaze. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember in the heat of the Republican primary, Glenn Beck was fervently anti-Trump.
Yes.
On similar grounds that you are and were and are. And now you have Glenn Beck. Basically, I think at one point I saw that he proudly donned a "Make America Great Again" hat and basically said that if Trump doesn't win in 2020, America's over, and he's sort of framing his somewhat newfound support in these apocalyptic terms. What would be, and I'm not trying to ask you to get inside his head, but is the best way to think about that evolution that he's responding to commercial incentives, meaning that there wouldn't be a large enough audience for him to have maintained the anti-Trump posture that he espoused in 2016 until now? Do you think there's any genuinity to it? How do you sort of explain that as somebody who was in the belly of the beast?
I think I can speak fairly intelligently about because I have personal experiences with him. I've met him. I've talked privately to him. I went on his show for the book. I did an interview with him for the book. And what I would say of what I know of Glenn, and if he ever hears this, Glenn, I'm more than happy for you to come on my podcast or come on this podcast and explain how I missed this. But he is, despite what a lot of people think, earnestly seeking what he hopes is good. And he's made up mistakes and terrible mistakes, and he's said that. And I think that what he made there was a mistake. And the reason was not because it's bad to change your mind. It's fine to change your mind. It's not because I think there's no way to support President Trump that's not immoral. I don't believe that. I think that there is a way. It's that I don't think I don't think that in that moment when he decided to do that he was thinking about more than what a lot of people call the culture war. He was looking at the situations regarding old issues on the right, abortion, religious liberty, and so on, and saying that the stakes were too high, which was roughly the argument for Trump in 2016. And I think it's an understandable conclusion for somebody to reach. Like, I get it. I get how somebody gets there. I try in the book to explain why I think there's more to think about. At least if you're somebody who believes there's an all-powerful creator of the universe and we're not just floating around on a speck, and it's all random, assuming there's some involvement by something intelligent that's more powerful than us, then I think there's more to consider. And one of those things to consider is, as a Christian, there are things that you may be afraid of. There are things you may be afraid will be taken from you. There are things that you may be worried you're not going to be allowed to do anymore. You should fight to be able to do those things. That's fine. But as a Christian, I think it's a mistake, and we talked about this on the show when I did the interview. I think it's a mistake to view Christian values as a possession of Christians. Christians should be looking at Christian values, in my opinion, as something they're hoping to attract other people to, not hoarding for themselves and voting for people that they otherwise would have despised in order to make sure nobody takes their stuff. And I think we've gotten lost in that, and Christians have, out of what they see as completely reasonable fears of marginalization of their beliefs. But that fear of that marginalization has turned it into something different, which is a focus on self-interest. Which, I get that self-interest on its own is not a bad thing. I have a self-interest in eating and so on. But, when you're doing that self-interest and believing that you're also fulfilling some sort of higher purpose, I think that you're probably deceiving yourself a little bit. And that's what I said on a show. I mean, I didn't say it directly like, that's what you're doing, Glenn. But I just said, I think that people have become so afraid that they're kind of willing to do anything to protect themselves. And we were warned in the Bible that that's not our highest objective. Our highest objective is not to protect ourselves from harm. It is to attract other people to what we're talking about. And that's lost in the way that they fight this culture war.
So you wouldn't attribute any kind of commercial motivation to his evolution, which is just to say that obviously his audience, I would assume, I haven't done an exact demographic study or anything, but I would assume that they're overwhelmingly stridently pro-Trump, and if he were to maintain his anti-Trump posture now, that would result in a reduction in his audience. Therefore, there's a pretty clear commercial incentive for him to change his attitude. You wouldn't describe that to him?
No, and not only because of what I know of him, but also because I think that if somebody was advising, they would have told them that would be a commercial mistake. Like, assuming for a second that he was completely, like, had no convictions at all and everything was commercially driven. And he had come out against Trump, and now he's questioning whether or not he should now come out for Trump. During that period of time between the election and when he did that, there was certainly movement within his own audience where some people left and new people came. His best and safest bet would have been to stay the course and not do something that drastic in order to win audience back, because none of the people who he lost, there was a very low likelihood any of them would have come back. He would have broken their trust as far as they were concerned. So I don't think so. No, I think it's possible that he makes decisions like that at a smaller level. Like, I could see him, this is never popular when they talk about blank. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. But this is like a really big, almost central to his identity thing, which is who it is that he supports in the highest office in the land. That's been the centerpiece of most of his career. I can't imagine he would have thought it would be a good idea to change horses midstream unless he just really thought it doesn't matter, I have to.
Mm-hmm. You talk a little bit about your tenure at RedState in the book. And I can remember thinking back down to the 2012 primaries when, as you mentioned, Rick Perry declared his presidential campaign at the annual Red State gathering, and that seemed to be the pinnacle of Red State's influence over the political process.
That was the top, man.
Yeah, you were riding high at that point. Eric Erickson was later on skeptical of Trump.
Frog in sight.
By the way, you keep saying peep frog. I could be wrong, but is it not Pepe Frog? I don't want to anger anybody.
I refuse to treat it with respect.
Okay.
So I refer to it. It's the same thing. I have a friend who refuses to say Tommy Loren, so she always says, Tammy, Toomey, things like that.
Okay. I don't think that Pepe the Frog or Peep the Frog is an inherently respectful visage in the first place, so I don't know what you call it would necessarily change that. I'm going
to change the whole alt-right by mispronouncing that name. That's going to change everything.
Right. You should tweet that out and see how it works.
The Peep Revolution.
Right. So looking back, like, how do you sort of trace the ascendants and the descendants of Red State's influence? I mean, apparently you kind of gave a passing mention to this in the book. I'm sort of curious from a gossip standpoint to know what happened. But you said that you were fired in 2018. Like, what's been how do you sort of summarize the trajectory of Red State at that one time being at the apex of sort of like Republican political power, whereas now it's kind of an afterthought, and other conservative media is much more influential?
Well, the first thing is that when Red State had reached that apex, it was mostly because we weren't feared by the left. We were feared by Republicans, because that's one of the reasons as you can see, I engage in a lot of criticism. And so it was a good fit for me, because what you did there was you tried to find people you thought were good, but you wrote a lot about what you thought was bad in the Republican Party. And it became a situation where candidates would start coming to these annual conferences to get sort of our seal of approval. I mean, not mine per se, but like, Eric Erickson's. And a lot of careers are considered to have kind of launched out of there, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley and so on, prior to Rick Perry doing that. So the concept was, this is a good launch pad, obviously. So what a better way to show that than to launch from here? What caused the downfall, and I'm not speaking, I do still have some friends that work there. So when I say the downfall, I'm not speaking to their traffic. I don't know their traffic. But in terms of the regularity with which I see them having an influence on situations that are being quoted, we occupied a unique space for a long time, holding the Republican Party accountable. When Trump came along, we were just kind of doing what we always did, holding Republicans accountable. And Trump was a Republican. So we were very anti-Trump, very anti-Trump. I can't think of one front page writer who did not express that there was no way in hell they were going to vote for him. And most of us wrote it right on the front page. We wrote it so much in 2011 when he first started floating the idea that he reached out to the previous owners and told them to tell us to shut up because we just had no patience for the guy. But we were purchased, RedState was purchased by Salem Communications, I believe in 2014, and they have an extensive network way beyond RedState. They had, town hall and hot air and a slew of radio stations. And as is the case with all partisan media, which that's not an insult, they are partisan media, openly partisan media. Part of what you do has to do with like how well you get along with all the people that are in the party that you are partisan for. That doesn't work very well if one of your most successful properties is constantly bagging on that party. And by that point, by the time the election was there, by the time the election was happening, we weren't just bagging on Trump. We were bagging on a lot of other Republicans who were supporting him. We were bagging on people who were voting for him, and we were bagging on Fox News. That's not exactly a recipe for fun golf outings with Sean Hannity if you're running town hall, if you're running Salem Communications. So we were often encouraged, let's say, to chill after he'd won. I think a lot of people thought we would. And several writers did, but several writers didn't. I was one of them who didn't, Jay Caruso, my brother Caleb, who was the editor-in-chief by then. None of us really softened that much, but we thought there was room for everyone. So there were people on the front page who were saying good things, people were saying bad things. But that's not a very consistent model when you have Salem Communications set up the way it is. So eventually they did kind of push out all the ones who were the most vocal critics. There were people there who were still not super impressed with Trump, certainly, but the question was not who stayed. The question was who was pushed out. And everyone who was pushed out, including my brother and a couple of other writers and Jake Russo and Patarico and so on, we had been probably the most vocal ones. So on the one hand, I look at it and I say, look, they have a business model. They wanted to achieve their business model. This didn't work for their business model. They let go of the people who were screwing with that. Okay, capitalism works, whatever. But the other side of it felt a little devious, which is you've got a power structure that depends on cheerleading, and this guy makes it hard to cheerlead because he can do things that are so chaotic. So the best thing we can do is just squash anybody who's not towing the line, and that's what I feel like happened. Because traffic was great when we left. It was up. It was good. So,
is there another entity in the conservative media landscape that you can see that kind of exerts comparable influence as RedState did at its apex, or has it all just sort of been subsumed into the personage of Trump, and therefore that's just not something that's available anymore?
Well, outside of everything else about Trump, there's a thing that's, I think it's important to remember. The grassroots, as it was, existed essentially as opposition to the establishment Republican Party. Yes, they protested against Democrats and so on, but there was a serious distaste and dislike of the Washington power structure as far as the Republican Party goes. When Trump was elected, he was the first one, whether or not I did not buy that he actually believed any of this, but at the very least, he was the first one who ran on the idea of, I've got balls to say what everybody needs to say and won't. So he was like their guy. And then when he got into office, and there was some tension at first with the trying to merge the previous GOP with this Trump GOP, that started to subside. People started getting fired. There began to be more uniformity. What does the grassroots do now? There's no real establishment to object to anymore. In fact, those of us who were called Never Trump, we're the ones who are kind of treated like the establishment. Most of the Republicans that used to be part of the so-called establishment are kind of been given a pass lately. So there was no place for those grassroots people to go. So there just isn't really a need for a red state. Not as it was. Whatever it is now, I'm sure it's filling some sort of need, but it is not the same need that was being filled in 2012.
I'm also just sort of curious, in light of everything that you wrote in the book and everything that we've discussed, what was at the core of the conservative media ecosystem, right, that led it to this point in your mind? I know, for example, Rush Limbaugh said something a couple weeks ago that I found amazing, which is that he basically conceded that nobody cares about debt and deficits, and
right.
The Republicans badgering Obama on that point for 8 years was all essentially a facade. So he was essentially admitting that he was engaged in fakery for the entire Obama tenure. And, liberals and leftists... Which,
by the way, that was already proven back in the TARP days as far as I was concerned, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, arguably, yes, but at the very least, the tack that they took vis-a-vis Obama in particular was predicated on a fiction, because the idea that he was running up the debt and deficit was really the number one thing that, especially the Tea Party and their allies in Congress, went after Obama on. So now you have Rush Limbaugh, who is this leading light of the conservative alternative media for decades, basically saying that was a farce. I mean, shouldn't that prompt some kind of deeper reflection on how the conservative media positioned itself all along, almost notwithstanding Trump? Because if that was just a charade in 2009, then with or without Trump, there would have been a problem there, right?
Right. Well, I would say that there's a lot of this that has to do with the uncharted territory of, I mean, it's not completely uncharted at this point, but the fairly new territory of the online world. Because, for a few years ago, bloggers, that was on the tip of everybody's tongues. I mean, when I was writing for RedState, we didn't call ourselves columnists or whatever. We called ourselves bloggers. And at first, bloggers were, nobody cared about them and they were irrelevant, and a couple of news items got big because of them. And next thing you know, we go to a conference and we're treated like, this special elite crew, while also, or we're talked to like we're a special elite crew, while being treated like the opposite. They'd say, "Oh, the bloggers are here. You guys are so important. We've got a special place for you guys. It's up in the fourth balcony in the back corner, and if you come out into the rest of the venue, you'll be arrested immediately. But it's a very, very elite place, so please go up there." And that was the world, was the blogosphere. Well, most of the people in the ranks of that blogosphere are now blue checks writing at a much bigger publication, or at CNN or MSNBC or something like that. And I think that a lot of the bones that were made, whether it was RedState or Hot Air or Breitbart News, which I think was probably most influential in that regard, or big government when it was under Andrew Breitbart, I think a lot of that was fused with the grassroots which, as I said, became a bit of a different mission once Trump had used the establishment and the presidency to be something the grassroots didn't object to anymore. I think that once we got to that point, the outrage that people had over the deficits and the debt and so on, they were all being expressed by people like me who had just a starry-eyed, Pollyannish view of what the world works like. I listened to a Republican tell me he cares about deficits. Obama is running a deficit. Republicans are mad. Heck yeah, I'm voting for Republicans. They're mad about the deficits. I believed this shit. And I think a lot of other people did too. And, again, to remind your audience, piano in the head, I get it. You're better than me. It's fine. But, at the time, what I would identify was more of the reverse, that I saw a lot of concern and consternation over deficits under Bush and less so under Obama, et cetera. So I was identifying what I thought is that sort of same hypocrisy. I just was unprepared for the blatant levels of hypocrisy. It's almost like I was better off when they gave me more to lie to myself about. And once they gave me less to lie to myself about, I just stopped altogether and had to back away from the whole thing. And a lot of other people didn't, because at the end of the day, if there's a deficit or there's a debt or there's any other problem that they used to have beef with under Obama and they don't under Trump, they only have a few questions to be perfectly fine with it. Okay, but is he pro-life? Okay, but is he going to appoint Supreme Court justices that are conservative? Okay, but is he going to be on the side of the bakers? Okay, yeah, deficits suck, but at least we got this stuff. So it's just becoming a much lower bar of expectation. I don't know if a Democrat gets into office and deficits start going up, if they'll go right back to that hypocrisy.
They will. They will. You don't have to. You don't have to have any question about it. They will.
I stay away from predictions, but I do feel safe saying I will accept your prediction.
Yeah, I don't make many predictions either, but that's one that I have zero doubt about. Okay,
yeah,
so
I'm not trying to be naive about it. I'm more just trying to have like a little hope for humanity, and that gets tough sometimes.
Okay, so if sort of the sensibility that you are evincing has any purchase at all in the wider kind of conservative electorate, then theoretically you'd think that there would be at least some appetite for these handful of Republican primary challengers who are now running against Trump. So Mark Sanford is running on a platform largely of criticizing Trump's spending and deficit,
and proving issues. How clever he is at getting away with flying to South America to cheat on his wife.
Yep. That's the one thing that people tend to know about him, thanks to Trump. And I remember Rachel Maddow.
I live in South Carolina, so it was hard for me to miss it.
Okay, I remember Rachel Maddow spent a full month on that when it happened in 2009. And you have Joe Walsh, who seems to have a more character critique of Trump, so he's not even necessarily contesting many of the policy items, although he does to some degree. But like the main thrust of Walsh's candidacy is based on his aversion to Trump's character. And then, William Weld, I guess, is somewhere in the middle. But do you put any stock in any of those candidacies?
It depends on what they are thinking they're going to accomplish. I was just actually talking to somebody about this today. The idea that the best way for the Republican Party, if they want a future, is to try to prevent Trump from winning. And I mean overtly. I'm not saying they can't have that as one of their objectives, but overtly, that's the only reason they exist. The potential to win or to prevent him from being the nominee or whatever. That seems like a farce fairy tale. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's room for third-party candidates. I do. I just believe that people have to stop being so next election focused. If you want the GOP to survive, past Trump, whether he wins in 2020 or stays all the way through 2024. What all of these candidates should be centering their campaigns around is a believable argument that there's a problem in the party that Trump exemplifies, and that new leadership is needed, and that they try to get people to hear them so that by 2024, there's already been a major discussion that perhaps had a few years to grow. But if you want to grow a real movement to contest Trump and unseat him from the right, you've got 13 months. It's not going to go that quickly. And if you put all your eggs in that basket, you're doing little more than throwing feathers at a boulder and spending a lot of money to do it. So to me, it's mostly about message. I'm not interested in supporting any third-party candidate at this point whose entire message is, we can do this. No, you can't. What you can do is start shifting the conversation, the Overton window, the ways that people speak to each other. You can encourage discourse. You could try to get on that stage. That would be a candidate that I would support, whose entire campaign was dedicated solely to being the third person invited to the major debates, despite the fact that he won't win, so that he could be up there, he or she could be up there, offering arguments that perhaps a lot of people need to hear, so they at least know they're out there and that it's something that can be grown from. Don't show up and tell me, when I've never even heard of you, that we should fall behind your leadership. Show me why you're a leader first. Then we'll talk about what can happen. There's not enough time to do that between right now and November, but there is plenty of time to get a movement started so that there can be a different dynamic in the coming elections.
Is there any potential Democratic nominee who you think could tempt you to be more inclined not to embrace Trump, but to accept the logic for supporting Trump that so many previous anti-Trump conservatives now adopt? Meaning, would Bernie Sanders, for example, pose such a mortal threat in your mind because he's going to try to implement socialism that you could foresee you saying, for all Trump's flaws and for all my objections to him, nonetheless, I'm actually going to accept the lesser of two arguments calculus because it's that important?
Well, the first thing I would say is I talk about the lesser of two evils argument in the book. And I think one of the things that, and these are the kinds of things you always think later. What I wish I had done a little bit was mention that there's nothing wrong inherently with picking between two bad choices. Like, we get offered two bad choices all the time. My objection, which I spent a lot of time on, was the idea that it is a moral imperative, as though you have no choice but to choose between lesser evils. It's literally die of starvation or steal food, and I object to all of that. So it's not that I have an issue with people saying, here's a bad choice and a worse choice, and I'm going to choose one or the other. When it comes to whether or not a Bernie Sanders, for instance, could cause me to vote, the only thing that could make me ever vote for Trump would be if I thought there was a better chance that for the next 4 years that just about nothing would get done. That would probably get me to do it. I don't think that's going to be a situation that happens, but I could imagine embracing that. His character is not something I spend a lot of time on anymore because it's mostly, to me, about the people who support him. He's going to be who he is, and he always has been. If Bernie Sanders ran a campaign and made clear, here's what he wants to do, and I found him to be very, very against everything I believe policy-wise and wanting to implement policies that were more in line with socialist ideals I don't share, I don't find it too realistic that he would be able to implement them, so it probably wouldn't sway me enough. So I guess, I know that's a both sides of my mouth answer, but that's because I find the likelihood of being in a situation for that kind of choice so small that I guess I haven't spent that much time to consider it. I had said back in 2016 that even Trump, there were people that if he was, that I might vote for Trump if so-and-so, I can't remember who I used to use, this guy in Florida, Alan Grayson. I said, if Alan Grayson runs the Democrats.
That's a throwback reference to the blog era.
Right. Like, so it wasn't, I don't cast Trump as like the evil Satan of our universe. I think he's a crappy guy. And I think he's got a lot of corruption and deceit in him. And I think he infects the GOP with it. But yeah, no, I should have been ready for that question. I don't think so. I mean, the scenarios that would cause me to vote for Trump are things that I would have to invent that are pretty unrealistic.
Mm-hmm. Because the converse is, for me in 2016, I would get hectored endlessly by liberals and Democrats saying that it was of absolute kind of like civilizational importance that I must vote for Hillary Clinton because Donald Trump was that grave of a threat. And I was always a little bit skeptical of this kind of apocalyptic naysaying about Trump, which actually continues now, which is that he's so mind-bendingly bad that he's going to collapse the entire republic. I mean, yeah, there are things that have happened that have been bad, but that style of rhetoric was always so overblown that I almost felt it was sort of like a bullying tactic to vote for to badger somebody into voting for a candidate who they just didn't support.
Is. Yeah, definitely there is. I mean, and I think that's probably what I was identifying with the book, was that it's a lot easier to use that bullying tactic if you can add on top of it, and God wants you to do it.
Right, so, right. That wasn't a factor for me.
Right. So that's part of what I'm identifying as the problem. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's some alternate universe where I could picture some scenario that would make me feel like, okay, I feel compelled to do it this way because, it's not a moral imperative or anything, but I'd rather this guy than that guy. Okay, fine, I'll do that. My issue is I have become so intensely focused on the idea that there are cultural forces at work that are pushing us further and further down a road of no accountability for leadership because they know that so many people are just going to pull the lever really no matter what, that there's less and less incentive for them to really do what they were sent there to do. And I don't want to, not only do I not want to participate, I want to encourage and help any movement I can that's going to start trying to shift and persuade people away from buying into that notion so that we can get back to a point where leaders are held accountable and that's not heresy. Trump has made that harder, a lot harder. I mean, back in the day with Bush, you could go after Bush as a Republican, and it wasn't a statement on the entire GOP. You could go after a politician that was a heavy supporter of Bush, and it wasn't necessarily a slight against Bush. But today, in today's GOP, because of the way Trump operates and because of the way his mind works, there's a loyalty factor that's so high that anything you do that sounds like you're not towing the line for Trumpism, for the Trump agenda, which now includes just about any politician who voices their support of him, you're a traitor, never Trumper, and you need to get out of the party. So, we got to move away from that, and that doesn't happen, in my opinion, really. There's mild effects from the voting booth, but most of it's just cultural. And from my perspective as a Christian, I think the church can and should try to play a role in that. And the first thing they should do is pull away their intense marriage to one political party, because not only does it have a negative impact on politics, it has a much greater and more concerning impact on faith.
Mm-hmm. So,
you've got one party that's basically now saying that the other party is going to hell. I mean, they're using religion and faith and something that I think should be good and compassionate to be cruel and divisive.
So,
Which, you know, I mean, I will grant you religion has a history of doing crap like that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't always, every time it happens, try to stop it.
So in the book, you quote this post that you made when Obama took office in 2009, where you revealed
God,
your...
you're not going to read it, are you?
What's that?
I said, "Oh God, you're not going to read it, are you?"
No, I'm not. I'm not gonna trouble my audience with that. But suffice to say, it was a very stark disavowal, not just of Obama, but of Obama supporters who you felt had treated conservatives unfairly all throughout the George W. Bush years. And one of the main reasons you cite for your perception of unfairness is how they were basically anti-war activists, or that they were very opposed to the Iraq War, and they were highly critical of Bush for his conduct of the war.
It was less that they opposed the war. It was more that their manner of opposing the war was to cast anyone who supported it as literal Nazis. And
right, or that they weren't sufficiently supportive of the troops or whatever. But I guess my question is, like, with the benefit of hindsight now, 10 years later, are you able to separate the emotional intensity of your feeling from that period from a more objective analysis of the Iraq War in particular? And do you now think that maybe the emotional intensity that you attached to the Iraq War clouded your judgment in any way?
Well,
I know that's a little bit outside the scope of the book, but it came to
no,
mind when I read that.
No, it's I think the first thing is, and this I attribute this to my writing, not your reading. I think that if the takeaway was that my intense feelings at that time were related to the Iraq War, that wasn't my intent. What had happened was there was a video that some celebrities had put together where they were calling for unity, essentially. Like they were
Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore, which I also found. I remember finding that obnoxious as well, but for probably different reasons than you.
Well, and so I watched that, and I could not at the time. My emotional drive, because by that point, I was already irritated about a lot of aspects of the Iraq War. So it wasn't about the Iraq War. It was about how I felt like my support of the president, my support of Bush, or the fact that I voted Republican, was an automatic impugning of who I was as a person. And that now that Obama had won, their guy won, it was, hey, let's be friends. I know I just called you a Nazi 2 days ago, but let's be friends. And that frustrated me in a very carnal way. It made me want vengeance. It made me want to stick it to them. It made me want to be obstinate, to be the party of no, to say compromise is a bad idea, to shame bipartisanship, to call liberals evil. It made me want to do all the things that I did start doing because I was angry and I felt mischaracterized. I felt unfairly treated, and that fueled so much of who I was for a long time. And I think, as I said, I got that kind of injection of nuance around 2015, like just prior to what happened with Trump, coming down that escalator. And part of the piano dropping on my head was just like, dude, you're just not a victim. Just calm down.
A lot of people would be better off if they took that message.
Well, I think, to be blunt, I was experiencing some new level of pain I had not experienced. And it made me realize how much of the things I saw as pain previously were nothing but petty frustrations built from ego. Not that I'm defending that people said those things to me. Don't misunderstand. I think it is horrible that people speak that way. And I don't call Trumpkins, I know it's not exactly nice to call them Trumpkins, but I don't call them Nazis. I don't go straight for this person and that person is racist, not because I don't believe that racism is there or that there are a lot of people who are racist, but rather because my goal these days is to try to find ways to get people who otherwise really freaking disagree with me to at least see me as somebody that's worth persuading. Because if they could put themselves in a position to believe that they might be able to persuade me, then maybe they'd also be okay with me seeing if I could persuade them. And then we have a good conversation. And I want to get to that point with Trump voters, with everyone. And the first way that you do that is something that I had to do in the wake of what happened with me in the wake of my divorce, which is we had 4 children. And at the time they were 4, 6, 8, and 10. And the worst thing that they could imagine happening in their little lives was happening. And I had a choice to hold on to angers and resentments and fears and frustrations, or I could let it all go in the hopes that she and I could work together, treat each other with dignity. And that turned out to be like the best thing I could do, and we're friends now. So I didn't know at the time that that's what I was building towards, but ultimately that's what the book is saying. Mm-hmm. I offer the criticism. I offer the my ideas, philosophical point of views, whatever you want to call it, on why there's so many bad rationalizations for the things that the right is doing these days. But I don't make excuses for things I think are bad on the left. And I kind of ultimately wrap the whole book up by saying none of this crap gets better if we look at everything as a 50-50 culture war where the only way to win is if we literally destroy half the people that are here. It won't work. We need to find a better way. And the first way to do that is to air your own grievances, admit your own crap, put aside your resentments, and work together.
The reason I brought up that little rant you did in 2009 is because you did mention the Iraq War as at least a factor that drove aspects of your resentment and bitterness. And I'm just wondering that although you lament Trump's influence on the right in so many respects, in the foreign policy domain in particular, Trump does seem to have moved the center of gravity on the right a little bit more toward non-interventionism, a little more skeptical of military conflict. Now, doesn't mean that his track record on that is perfect, and he's, I think, erred in many respects on foreign policy issues. But how do you sort of contextualize that shift? Is that something that you embrace at all? Do you see any upsides in that movement on the right in the foreign policy domain in particular, at least in comparison to what it was under Bush?
Well, let me start by saying, in terms of what I think, you're essentially talking about Trump, I guess moving the Overton window a little bit on the right in terms of whether or not we are hawkish or not, and whether or not the neocons are more in control of the foreign policy. So I'll start there, because if he was doing something that was truly a well thought out, competent policy of less intervention and more working in diplomacy with other nations, sure, that would be great. I'd like that. I think I've always felt that way. Even though I was also in a position where, when I believed that this was something that needed to happen, I was also okay with that. The problem for me with Trump is I don't really think that's what he's doing. I think that what he's doing is mostly rhetorical. I understand that translates into policy in a lot of ways, but it's mostly rhetorical from his point of view. He knows that a lot of his support centered around the idea of moving away from so-called neocon foreign policy. And so he does talk that way. But he also tweets about bombing people to smithereens and, rattles his saber in ways that I find extremely antagonistic, and talks openly about strategic possibilities regarding war with other nations on a public forum for the world to see, with what I would probably feel pretty confident saying was not exactly the approval of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That scares the crap out of me, because even if he's intervening less, he's also isolating us in a, crazy old man who tells everybody to get their off his yard type of way, which doesn't do great things for our standing in the world and probably creates more alliances amongst dangerous countries who see this as a weakness. So that concerns me a lot. But if it was something like you were describing, as a well thought out plan that protected not only our interests but our allies, didn't leave others in a lot of ways defenseless, he would be happy to leave Europe and South Korea and Japan and all of these other countries that have felt the security blanket of our presence. He'd leave them out to dry in a second. And I find that to not be the best way to maintain our position in the world. I don't want to invade other countries or police other countries. I'd be happy with a world where our involvement was in conjunction with other countries and that we did not work directly with nations that were committing human rights violations and used sanctions powers and things of that nature to try to influence change in those areas. That would be a great foreign policy to me. I don't in any way think the best way to do things is to re-engage in, colonialism or something.
Right. Okay, so one final question to sort of sum everything up. And tell me if you've been asked this question before. I would wager that you haven't, but I'm sort of interested in how you would convey the lessons that you've gleaned over the course of this experience to a non-Christian audience or an atheistic audience. I know you wanted to reach the maximum audience possible in the book, and in the earlier part, you sort of were more descriptive than proscriptive.
Right.
But if somebody just does not share your belief in the divinity of Jesus, right, or is a staunch atheist, what insights should they take from these trends that you've observed that maybe could be applicable to aspects of their own lives, and how power can corrupt, and how people who you might have relied on as trustworthy end up again sort of giving themselves over to these nefarious political forces? What's the secular lesson, if any, from this?
I think the secular lesson, and I actually did a long interview with a guy who's definitely an atheist, and very as into being an atheist as I am being a Christian. You know what I mean?
Who is that?
Michael Malice.
Oh, okay. Yep. I've done his show.
Yeah. You agree with that description, right?
I don't know that I've ever discussed religion with him. But
yeah, I mean, he wasn't like a jerk about it. I'm just saying he very much believes what he believes, just as I very much believe what I believe.
He's a member of the irreligious right.
Right. And so, but we had a great conversation, because I talked about how I think a lot of the arguments that I make in terms of moral imperatives and things like that, I'm writing them in a way, because I wrote them to that audience, that certainly if you didn't believe there was an underlying absolute morality guided by a supreme being, it's not going to be a very compelling argument. But in the book, I'm actually going to give you two answers here. In the book, I do end it by saying that the takeaway that somebody could have from the book is that I tried to take them through the journey of the anger that I just described, that I went through when I was, writing that article you were talking about, how they got to the point where they viewed their situation as being under attack, and how that changed the way they wanted to approach politics, or at least released them from trying to hide that anymore. And that what I wanted people who were outside of it to think about was where they stood in all of the points of that evolution. Were they because I think whether you're a Christian or you're not, I think there is a agreed upon idea that if you can help somebody stumbling or falling, you should. You should try. You should try to be somebody that's looking to make the world a better place, essentially, which doesn't require a supreme being for people to feel. So what I wanted at the end of the book was for people to ask themselves, these guys have kind of gotten to the point where they're practically proud when they're being an asshole. How did I help get us here? And if I can figure out how did I help get us here, then maybe I can help figure out how to get us out of here. That was what I asked for in the book. But generally speaking, what I would say is I have a strong belief that the concept of absolute morality is important. I understand, not everybody agrees that absolute morality is like coded into us by God, but we do all generally believe in certain things as being absolute. We believe in the absolute morality of, murder's wrong, things of that nature, not just in a civilized sense, not just in if we're going to have a civilization way, but just generally speaking, it's considered, no, that's immoral. Whether there's a God or there is no God, that's immoral. Where I would like to see everyone pull back a little bit is on the relativism of trying to find, those morals become flexible in these particular situations, which are often primarily guided by fear, anxiety, ignorance, hatred, all the bad things that put people in a position where they're suddenly morally flexible. And I just wish that most people would think about the idea of, no, there are certain things you just don't do. The ends do not justify the means, whether there's a God or there is no God. If we don't evolve enough in a godless universe, if we don't evolve enough to understand that we're creating a worse humanity by focusing more on an end result than on the means of getting there, then I think we're in deep shit. And I hope that people of all faiths or no faiths will take that away from the book.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. Thank you, Ben, for doing this. It was an interesting discussion.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Bye.
All right, bye.
All right, there you have it. Hope you found that edifying as usual. If you appreciate anything that I produce, please consider a contribution via Patreon or PayPal, the information for which is always in the description box where you consume this content, and I will talk to you next time.